All right, it's good to be with you all today. I used to teach in this part of the country over at Whitworth College, so it's great to be here with folks from K-House. Chuck and I used to get together occasionally when I was a professor there, and it's been nice to be able to renew acquaintance recently as we've been trading recently published books with each other through the mail. I'm going to talk today about my book called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. And the lecture today will actually sketch the thesis, the argument of that book. I'd like to begin by just putting the debate about intelligent design in some historical context. Last year marked the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. In fact, just a few months ago, it was November 24th, 2009, and the occasion of that anniversary caused a lot of reflection worldwide, especially in the academic world, about the legacy of Darwin. What did he teach us? And some scientists and some scholars said that he, of course, gave us the idea, the theory of evolution. He gave us the idea of natural selection. But principally, the legacy for which he is best known, according to many scholars, is that by giving us the theory of evolution and the idea of natural selection, he refuted the classical argument from design, the idea that nature bears witness to a designing intelligence, to, in fact, as the classical medievals put it, the intelligence of God. And many Darwinian scholars have made this point very, very pointedly. One is Francisco Ayala, who is a past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He put it this way. He says, the functional design of organisms and their features would seem to argue for the existence of a designer. But it was Darwin's greatest accomplishment to show that the directive organization of living beings can be explained as the result of a purely undirected mechanism, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator or any other external agent. As he put it more succinctly in one of his articles, Darwin gave us design without a designer. The famous evolutionary biologist from England, Richard Dawkins, who's also a public spokesman for Darwinism all around the world, has expressed the same idea. He said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. If you were all college students, I'd ask you to identify the key word in that quotation. It's obviously appearance. That for the Darwinist, things look as though they were designed. They have the appearance of being designed, but that appearance is actually an illusion because there is a purely undirected mechanism that can mimic the powers of a designing intelligence, but which is not in any way guided or directed. And that mechanism is Darwin's mechanism of natural selection. Now, when Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, many people don't realize this, but he did not actually attempt to explain the origin of the very first life. What he did was he wanted to explain where all the new appearances of design, if you will, came from across the whole history of life. He presupposed the existence of a first cell, but then wanted to explain how the mechanism of natural selection, his survival of the fittest mechanism, could explain all the new forms of life that had arisen from the very beginning of life until now. So I have on the screen a picture of his famous tree of life diagram. And it is a representation of what Darwin thought the history of life was like. He thought that if you started way back at the beginning with a simple cell, one-celled organism, and that there was a lot of, with the mechanism of natural selection acting on all the minute variations that would take place, that one organism would gradually morph into another and produce all the new forms of life we have today. So the branches on his tree represent all the forms of life that we have today, and the trunk at the beginning, at the base of the tree, represents the life form at the very beginning. And what Darwin attempted to do was to explain away the emergence of all those new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms going all the way back to the very beginning. Now, in the process, he also, and this is where the scholarly discussion of his legacy comes in, he also thought that he had explained away all the appearance of design that arose along the way, whether it was the eye of the vertebrates or the coiled nautilus with its beautiful shape, or the 3 or the 4-chambered heart of mammals or reptiles, all these things in biology that look so much like they're the product of engineering or forethought or design, he thought that his mechanism of natural selection was capable of explaining that design away, not as the product of a designing intelligence, but rather as the product of a purely undirected process. Now, why did he think that? Let's just do a little review on that, and then we'll address the question of whether or not he was successful. Well, if you remember, you might imagine that you're the 19th century biologists were very impressed with a particular phenomenon that they called adaptation. They noticed that organisms seemed to be adapted or well fitted to their environments. And they thought, and in fact, biologists for several hundred years thought that evidence of adaptation was an evidence of design. It showed that the designer had made the organisms to live in particular environments. So fish live in water, and they have gills and fins. Birds live in the air. They have wings that enable them to fly and lungs that enable them to process a great amount of oxygen. Animals that live in cold climates have very thick fur or wool. Animals that live in hot climates can dissipate heat. So that adaptation seemed to indicate design, according to biologists until Darwin's time. But Darwin thought that he could explain adaptation as the result not of intentional design, but instead as the result of natural selection. And here's an example that illustrates his concept and his insight. Imagine you're a sheep herder in the far north of Scotland, and you've got you want to breed a woollier breed of sheep. What do? Well, it's been well known for a long time. It's called artificial selection. Ranchers and farmers could choose certain characteristics in dogs or sheep or pigeons or whatever the animals were and amplify them by selecting only, for example, the woolliest males and the woolliest females to breed. And then if they did that for several generations, they would find that they'd get a woollier breed of sheep. And what Darwin thought was, well, that's obviously an intelligently designed process, but he proposed a way by which that could happen without any design or guidance at all. And his idea was, well, he said, what if we had a series of very cold winters, such that only the woolliest males and females survived? And what if after winter after winter after winter, there were no intervening hot winters or warm winters, mild winters, such that after a while you had the exact same outcome as choosing intentionally only the woolliest. So nature ends up doing what the intelligent breeder does. Nature ends up naturally selecting what had previously been only possible to produce by intelligence. And so natural selection for Darwin became a mechanism that not only was responsible for change, but could also do away with the need to invoke intelligence as a cause for the adaptation that seemed, above all, to bespeak design to biologists prior to, say, 1859. So natural selection replaced the design hypothesis. And that's why scholars today say that's the main legacy of Darwin. But the question now today in modern biology is that really true? Did he really explain away every appearance of design? And if not, has some other undirected mechanism been able to explain away other appearances of design? Turns out there's a lot of biologists today who are now questioning the creative power of Darwin's mechanism. It's one thing to say, you can get sheep that will adapt to environment and get a little woollier. You might get some finches in the Galapagos Islands whose beaks get a little longer, a little shorter in response to varying weather conditions. There's the famous example of the peppered moths in England. They get darker, lighter. But can you build moths or sheep or birds in the first place through this mechanism of natural selection? In other words, can it only explain modest adaptation, or can it explain the origin of the fundamentally new forms of life and the big structures that arise during the history of life? Well, that's a big debate, and it's going on right now in the technical literature in biology. There is a growing number of scientists who are dissenting from the idea that natural selection has the creative power that was attributed to it by Darwin. But whether or not, whatever side of that debate you fall on, I happen to be a Darwinian skeptic, But whether you're a skeptic about Darwin's ability to explain away design at that level, at the level of what's called macroevolutionary change, there is a key issue in evolutionary biology, in the history of life, where it's clear that Darwin did not succeed in explaining away design. That is to say, I'm going to, in this lecture, concede, as lawyers say, ad arguendo, for the sake of argument. I'm going to concede the whole of Darwin's theory. I happen to be a skeptic of the theory. But what I'm trying to point out is that even if you accept Darwin's theory, there is a critical evidence of design that neither he nor anyone else has explained away by reference to natural selection or any other unintelligent, undirected mechanism. And that issue is the origin of the very first life. If you look at Darwin's tree and you look at the base of the tree and focus there, it turns out that there's a critical problem that all evolutionary biologists today acknowledge has been unsolved by any undirected evolutionary mechanism. And that is the problem, the origin of life. Now, in Darwin's time, scientists didn't worry about this so much. They knew that that Darwin didn't propose a theory for how life began in the first place from simpler non-living chemicals. But they also assumed a view of life that suggested that life wasn't all that complicated, and therefore that it didn't really manifest much of even an appearance of design. The 19th century view of the cell was that it was a simple a little glob of jello. We knew from microscopes at the time that the cell was an enclosure and that there was some kind of chemistry going on in there, but scientists at the time assumed that it was very simple chemistry, that with a couple, they actually had a name for the substance they thought was the essence of life. They called it protoplasm. And so one of Darwin's contemporaries, Thomas Huxley, said the cell is a simple, homogeneous globule of protoplasm. Or in another place he said, a simple, homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. It's just chemical jello. And if you think of life in that way, it's not hard to think about how life might have arisen in a one- or two-step process. You might have a few simple chemicals. They react to form some slightly more complex chemical compounds. They react, and boom, you've got the protoplasm. That was the kind of idea that people had about how life must have began in the 19th century. Now, I love this quote from Huxley because it makes me feel so smart. This is one of the greatest biologists of the 19th century, and he was completely ignorant of everything that we now know about the complexity, the integrated complexity of the inner workings of life. So let's look forward a little bit and look at some of the things that have been discovered that have completely altered our view of life and completely and made more difficult this problem of the origin of life. My grad school supervisor had a quotation in one of her articles about the problem of the origin of life, and she said that at the heart of the problem of the origin of life lies a fundamental question, and that question is, what is it exactly that we're trying to explain the origin of? Awkward phrase, the origin of, but that's, what are we trying to explain the origin of? If you think life is simple, if it's just a simple chemical jello, it's pretty easy to imagine that you could produce life in a couple simple chemical steps. But if you think of life as something like a chemical factory run by digital code, which is what we're now beginning to realize, then it becomes much more difficult. And one of the first things that was discovered that began to break down this simplistic concept of life that made scientists think it was so easy to explain its origin was the discovery of the structure of proteins during the 1950s. And I like to use a more precise phrase to describe what was discovered about proteins. We discovered that they were very complex and also that they were very specific or specified. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Let's start with some pictures of proteins. Proteins, first of all, are the molecules that do all the important jobs inside cells. They catalyze reactions, they build structural parts, they process information on DNA, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So they do all the important jobs that keep living systems alive. And up until the 1950s, scientists had very simplistic ideas about proteins, just as previously they had very simplistic ideas about the cell. They thought of them as like that they would end up being things like hat boxes stacked on each other, or cigars all stacked like, or Lincoln logs or something like that, that they would be highly regular, very simple structures. The big surprise in the 1950s is that they turned out to be highly intricate, three-dimensional shapes, and even more important than that was the discovery that the intricate three-dimensional shapes that proteins have is critical to their function. So I've got a slide here of a protein, an enzyme protein, the job of which is to break apart a two-part sugar. And you can see that the sugar, which looks on the slide like a little barbell, nestles into the shape of the protein that is going to catalyze that breakage. And you can see that there's a beautiful kind of hand-and-glove fit between the enzyme and the sugar that enables that chemical reaction to go forward. And that's the case with almost all proteins. They do their job because of a lock key or more aptly a kind of hand-and-glove fit where one molecule matches spatially the other. And that three-dimensional specificity is the key to the function of the protein. But it turns out that three-dimensional specificity derives from a more fundamental one-dimensional specificity, a specificity of arrangement. And I've got a visual aid that makes this clear. These are snap lock blocks. My kids are now teenagers, but I stole these from them when they were about 2 or 4 years old, because it said on the box ages 2 to 4. They're little colored beads of different shapes. And what I'm using them to do is to illustrate what proteins are made of. Proteins are made of smaller molecules called amino acids. And there are 20 different amino acids that are part of proteins. And proteins only become proteins. They only acquire those intricate three-dimensional shapes I was talking about when the amino acids line up in a very specific sequence or order, and then as a result of their lining up properly, they exert forces on each other and cause the chain to fold into a specific shape. If it's the right shape, you will call it a protein because it will do a job. If it doesn't form the right shape, it'll go limp, or it'll form a shape that has no biological relevance. And so it turns out that the arrangement of these amino acids is critical. If I were, for example, to change this blue one here with a yellow one, just rearrange them a little bit, very oftentimes a slight change in sequencing can cause the whole protein to lose its function. And so proteins have a property that biologists will sometimes refer to as sequence specificity. That means the sequence or the function of the whole depends upon the sequential arrangement of the parts. Now, can you think of anything else that has this property? One of the things that first leapt to mind for Francis Crick, who was one of the early molecular biologists in the 1950s, was informational text. He likened proteins to, and the way that amino acids the sequencing of amino acids is critical to the function of proteins. He likened them to the old type blocks that were used to set the headlines of newspapers. That for each amino acid, and we have the chemical formulas here, you have each amino acid has the same kind of backbone, but coming out of it, there's a different sticky outie, a different technical term, side chain. And depending on the arrangement of the side chains, you would either have a functional protein or not. Just like the fonts on the type blocks would be sticking out from the blocks, and it's the arrangement of those letters that would determine whether you were conveying information, functional information or not. So the proteins have this property of sequence specificity, and the other things that we know that have that property are things like computer code, English text, and other written languages. So very interesting. It raised a question for scientists who are trying to explain the origin of life. Where does that sequence specificity come from? How do you explain its origin? If proteins are complex and also specified, how do they acquire those unique properties? And just to review the things I've just said, three key features of proteins. One, their shapes are responsible for the functions they perform. The folded chains of amino acids are what create the shapes, and then it's the precise arrangement of amino acids that's responsible for the sequencing or the functioning, or ultimately responsible for function. So the big question for people working on the origin of life, starting in the 1950s, was how do you explain the origin of these intricate protein molecules, which in many cases are actually functioning much like machines? And they have this intricate three-dimensional specificity and the one-dimensional arrangements. How do the amino acids know to get arranged that way? Well, almost no sooner had this question been proposed that there was a kind of an important breakthrough, and it came with the work of Watson and Crick in 1953. We learned about the specificity of arrangement of proteins and the amino acids in the proteins in 1952. In 1953, Watson and Crick developed, they had this great breakthrough in that they elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule. And they discovered that it was this wonderful double helix, and they determined that the helix had a very beautiful chemical structure, what's called a sugar phosphate backbone on the outside of the molecule, and then these chemicals called bases along the interior of the molecule. Now that was very interesting from the standpoint of the chemistry itself. What's the structure of DNA? They solved that problem. But 4 years later, Francis Crick came up with what I think is the most important insight in molecular biology, maybe the whole history of biology, and it's called the sequence hypothesis. And what he proposed was that along the spine of the DNA molecule, those four chemicals that are called bases function just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters, zeros and ones, in a machine code. That is to say, it's not the chemistry of those constituents that determines their function. Instead, it's the precise arrangement of those characters that's critical. It's like if you're playing Scrabble and you've got a pile of letters next to the board. Those letters and the physical properties of them are insignificant until you arrange them properly so you can get that triple word score. It doesn't matter whether the letters are made of wood or plastic or whether they were ink or whatever. It's the arrangement that enables them to perform a function. And this was a key breakthrough. And now what I'd like to show is what that information inscribed along the spine of the DNA molecule does. This is an animation clip of the DNA, and we're going to see that it's critically important to building the proteins that we've just been talking about. This is a big protein complex called a polymerase, and it attaches to the DNA molecule. And it makes a copy of the original instructions that we were seeing on the DNA. And now we see on the inside of the polymerase that copy being built as these letters in the genetic alphabet, the bases, one by one, are positioned along the strand of the DNA, and we get a copy then that's spit out. Whereas DNA has two strands, this copy is a one-stranded molecule called a messenger RNA. It has all the instructions from the DNA molecule, and now we're going to see what those instructions do inside the cell. First, they're going to pass through a really interesting molecular machine that controls the traffic inside and outside of the nucleus of the cell. And once that transcript is passed through, it's going to go to a two-part chemical factory called a ribosome. And what we're going to see now is that the ribosome is a kind of chemical factory where proteins are constructed in accord with the information on the messenger transcript, this RNA molecule. The message is on the top, and we're seeing little adapter molecules that come in that have three letters that match up the letters on the message, and they bring in one by one in a very mechanical way amino acids that correspond to the information that's inscribed on the messenger transcript. So depending on the arrangement of those base letters, you'll get a different amino acid linking in one by one by one. And so they're actually literally dictating how the cell builds the proteins out of the 20 different amino acids that are possible. And then we've seen here in the animation that protein will come off. It will eventually fold into a beautiful three-dimensional shape. And then it will be released into the outer part of the cell to go do the job it does in the cytoplasm. Okay? So this is an intricate mechanical process, but it's all being driven by the information on the DNA molecule, which is copied and then carried out to a place where it can direct the manufacturing of the proteins and protein parts. I like to liken this process to something that we're increasingly familiar with in the engineering world. It's a technology called CAD/CAM, Computer Assisted Design and Engineering. I'm from Seattle, and if you go to the Boeing plant in Seattle, you will find engineers using digital information to direct the construction of mechanical parts. An engineer will sit at a console, will make some selections of parameters. Those parameters will be literally codified into digital code. They'll be sent down a wire, translated into another form of code that can be read by a manufacturing center, and then that information will direct, for example, the placement of rivets onto an airplane wing or something. So we're very familiar with the kind of technology that we found at work inside the cell. It's digital technology directing manufacturing. Now, all of this has raised a very great mystery, and I like to call this mystery the DNA enigma. We now know, thanks to Watson and Crick, the structure of the DNA molecule. We also know that the DNA molecule encodes information in a digital form. Those A's, C's, T's, and G's that chemists use to represent the different bases, as they're called, are sequentially arranged to direct the construction of proteins. So we know the structure of the DNA molecule, we know that it contains information, we know even what the information does, that's what the animation was just showing, but there's a big mystery surrounding that information, the information in DNA. Any guesses? It's the mystery of the origin of the information. It's not what it does, it's not where it resides. We know where the hereditary information resides, or at least much of it is along the spine of the DNA molecule. We know the structure of DNA, but what has become an increasingly acute mystery in the field of evolutionary biology, or a subdiscipline of that that's sometimes called origin of life research, is the question of where did the information come from? Now, I first encountered this mystery in 1985. I was a young scientist. I was working in geophysics. My job was to look for oil. My boss was a Texan, and he said, your job is to look for oil out in the Gulf. The Gulf was the Gulf of Mexico, and oil is actually the Texas way of saying O-I-L. And but I was doing using an early information-based technology called digital signal processing, and so I became very interested in the whole question of information. And I later attended a conference where I discovered that the mystery of information in DNA was at the heart of that mystery that Darwin had never solved, the mystery of the origin of life in the very first place. And so I got very interested in this. And one scientist put it this way. He said that the problem of the origin of life is basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. I used to ask my college students a question: if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know the answer is obvious. You have to give it code. You have to give it software. Well, it turns out that the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, you have to have, at the very least, a whole new suite of proteins, which requires a whole lot of information encoded in DNA in order to build those proteins. If you want to build life in the first place, just a simple little cell, you've got to have proteins, and that means you've got to have the information in the DNA molecule to build those proteins. And that has become the fundamental question that scientists are facing as they're attempting to explain the origin of life. Where did that information come from? If we could explain the origin of the information, then maybe we could explain the origin of life. Now, just tying back to the original theme that I struck about Darwin's legacy. Remember I said that Darwin's legacy was that he had, according to his chief proponents today, that he explained away the appearance of design without invoking an actual designing intelligence. He refuted the design argument. But here we have, with the digital code in DNA, a critically important appearance of design that has not been explained away by any undirected mechanism such as natural selection. And here's Richard Dawkins making this point, although not wanting to fully acknowledge it, I guess. What he says is that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal. We're looking at digital code. So that's a striking appearance of design. Why is that an appearance of design? Well, because when we find digital code today, it's typically the result of a programmer, of a designing intelligence. Bill Gates, our local hero in Seattle, has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever devised. So as I got more and more interested in this whole question of the origin of life, I eventually went to England to do my graduate work, and I ended up doing my dissertation on the question of the origin of life. And as I began to, I started to investigate whether or not this mystery that I had encountered at an early scientific conference was as acute as I had thought. On the panel that I'd listened to at this conference in 1985, the scientists universally acknowledged that we didn't have an explanation for the origin of life, and they kept coming back to this problem of the origin of information. So as I began to investigate this was one of the first things I wanted to find out. Is this problem as difficult as I had been led to believe by my first exposure to discussions about the origin of life in the first place? And what I discovered was that it was indeed very difficult. There were a number of different approaches that scientists had devised to try to explain the origin of life. One of the first ones was to rely simply on chance. This isn't popular anymore with scientists, but in the 1950s, it was the first thing that occurred to many scientists. If you just have enough time, eventually you're going to stumble on to one of these sequences that will have the information that you need to build proteins. The problem with this is it became clear very quickly, however, and that is that there is so much information encoded in DNA and so little time, even assuming a 20 billion year universe all the way back to the Big Bang, that it becomes very, very difficult to imagine how you would ever stumble onto one of these very few functional sequences of characters in the DNA molecule or in proteins, either one. And the math is basically the same either way. I have a little illustration that I used in class a lot, where I would get my students who would usually, they'd often heard that, well, the way to explain life is by chance. If you give enough time, anything can happen. Well, first of all, you don't have an infinite amount of time. Even if you assume a 20 billion year universe, that's a finite amount of time. But secondly, I had them do a little thought experiment just let's test how powerful is chance for producing information. And I'd walk around the class and have them pull letters out of a Scrabble bag at random. And the students would take the letters, and I got a blank here. That's not too helpful. And I get an N, and I had one rule: you had to write the letters on the board without thinking about the arrangement. You had to do them at random. So I get N, I, and Z, and L, and very quickly, picking letters at random, you get gibberish. Every once in a while, there'd be an exception to this. 2 or 3 letters in, you might have an important word like mug or ip or nid, or something that was at least word-like, and the students would go, oh, we're going to prove the professor wrong. We're going to show that you can really you can generate information by chance. Well, you can get a little bit, but if you need a lot of information, the chance is not the way to go. And I would always illustrate this point, especially if the students were lucky enough to get a 2 or 3 letter word going, by just simply running the experiment longer and just keep walking around the room. By the time you get to the 6th, the 7th, the 8th letter, the gibberish was swamping the functional, the little elements of meaning that had maybe started to develop. And this is essentially what scientists working on the origin of life determined, which is that if you need a little bit of information, chance might get it for you. But if you need a lot of information, as you do in even a single gene is typically about 1,200 to 2,000 bases properly sequenced, genetic letters properly sequenced. That's a lot of information. And to build even a simple cell, estimates vary needing between 250 and 500 proteins and their corresponding genes. So one gene builds one protein, or roughly so. You've got a lot of information even to build a single cell. So the conclusion was chance can't get the job done. Now, here's a scientist who says as much, one of the leading origin of life researchers in Scotland. He says, blind chance is very limited. Low levels of organization, he can produce exceedingly easily the equivalent of a few small letters or words, but he becomes very quickly incompetent as the amount of organization increases. So I realized as I studied this more that attempts to explain the origin of information by reference to chance weren't going to get the job done. In fact, in my book, Signature in the Cell, I go through some very detailed calculations to show that even if you assume that every event from the beginning of the universe until now was devoted to attempting to find functional arrangements of amino acids or functional arrangements of bases, out of all the possible arrangements, the odds are extremely small that you would ever stumble onto even a single protein. Odds on the order of 1 in a trillion trillion. And that's assuming all those trials, that every event, every interaction between molecules, all the way from the beginning till now, was devoted to looking for the informational sequences you need to build life. It's not enough time. It's not a plausible hypothesis. So as a result of that, I began to investigate some other things, or rather I began to study what other scientists had investigated, and I found that other attempts to explain the origin of information were also failing. And one of these was a kind of Darwinian attempt to combine the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection with chance. And because after all, the Darwinists never relied simply on chance alone. They always said you'd get a random mutation that would confer some small survival advantage on an organism, and then that advantage would be passed on because it would be preserved, because it allowed the organism to survive better. That's what was meant by natural selection. So that raised, some scientists said, well, maybe natural selection could be operating on a pre-biological level, before you had life, to explain the origin of information. Maybe it was operating on a kind of chemical level. But the problem with this is that it really stretched the concept of natural selection to a breaking point. When I just described how natural selection worked, what did I assume? I assumed that you had an organism that was capable of reproducing, and that you would get variations within the offspring, one of which would confer a survival or functional advantage, which would be preserved and passed on, and then you would gradually begin to alter the features of a population. That's the way Darwin's theory is supposed to work. But how can you make any sense of that if you're talking about a natural selection producing the information you need to build life in the first place? If you don't have life, you don't have reproduction. And if you don't have reproduction, you don't have natural selection. And so the problem with this proposal, sometimes called the idea of pre-biological natural selection, is that, as one evolutionary biologist said it, it's a contradiction in terms. It formally begs the question, to use the term that philosophers use. Here's a diagram that makes this clear. If you want to get natural selection going, you have to have living organisms that are capable of replicating themselves or reproducing themselves. And here's the rub. In all organisms, self-replication, whether it's by sexual or asexual means, occurs as the result of DNA being copied with the help of very specific proteins. So, wait a minute, what are we trying to explain the origin of? We're trying to explain the origin of the information in DNA and the critical sequence-specific proteins. So if you invoke natural selection to try to explain the origin of information, and yet you need information in order to make natural selection work, you've begged the question of where that information came from in the first place. It's like this. It's like the absent-minded philosopher who is walking home from class, and he gets halfway home and he falls in a pit because he's thinking deep philosophical thoughts. And he's at the bottom of the pit, and he suddenly realizes, wait a minute, there's no problem here. I can get out of this pit. All I have to do is get a ladder and climb out. So he says, no problem. He goes home and he gets a ladder, comes back, he jumps down in the pit and climbs out. What's wrong with the story? The story begs the question of how he got out of the pit in the first place. And this is the problem with invoking natural selection to explain the origin of information. You're invoking a mechanism that only works once you have information. And one leading scientist who works on the origin of life, a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, Christian de Duve, has put it this way. He says, theories of pre-biological natural selection fail because they need information, which implies they have to presuppose what is being explained in the first place. So as I investigated this style of theory, this category of explanation, I realized that these were dead ends as well. Invariably, they beg the question of where do you get the information to even begin talking about natural selection. So that led me to a third category of proposed explanation for what I call the DNA enigma, for the origin of the information you need to produce the first life. And this is where more of the action has been recently among evolutionary scientists. They're trying to explain the origin of information by reference not to chance, but by reference to what is often called law or sometimes necessity. There's a famous book called Chance and Necessity by one of Francis Crick's colleagues. He was making the point that that's how scientists should go about their work. They should try to explain everything they see either by the result of chance or by the result of necessity. If I drop a ball and it falls to the earth, we say it falls as the result of the law of gravity, or that the law of gravity describes that motion, and then scientists will say because it's law-like, it happens by necessity. It must happen. Okay? So some scientists thought, well, if you can't explain life by chance, you can't explain life by chance and natural selection combined, maybe you can explain life as the result of pure natural law, natural necessity. And these guys had an idea which it was kind of sensible at the time. It was the late 60s when these ideas were first being formulated. And their idea was that just as crystals of salt form because of law-like forces of attraction between the different elements in the crystal. You got Na with a plus charge, and you got Cl with a minus charge. That describes a force of attraction. There's a bond that forms between the Na and the Cl, and as more and more of those elements come into contact with each other, they form a nice regular structure. NaCl, NaCl, NaCl. Highly ordered. And that ordering is the result of forces of chemical attraction that can be described by chemical formulas or laws of nature. Maybe, the suggestion was, maybe you could explain the ordering, the sequencing of the bases in the DNA molecule as a result of similar forces of chemical attraction. So it's not the result of chance, but it's the result of law. And certainly it's not the result of anything disreputable like intelligence or design. And so these ideas came to have a name. They were called self-organizational theories. The idea was that the ordering, the sequencing of the critical information-bearing parts of DNA and protein were the result of self-ordering tendencies that were chemical in nature. We see some self-ordering processes all the time. If you drain a bathtub, you get a nice vortex. The force of gravity acting on the water, being forced through that little hole creates an orderly structure. Could DNA, or more importantly, could the information in DNA be explained in a similar way? Well, it turns out it can't. And the diagram I have on the screen actually illustrates that, and I would ask you to give your attention to the chemicals on the interior of the DNA molecule. They're the bases. They're the information-carrying constituents of the DNA molecule. And also give your attention to the little sticks, the thin sticks in this. This is a representation of the chemical structure of DNA. The little sticks represent chemical bonds, forces of attraction. Do you see that there's a chemical bond between the circles and the pentagons, the sugars and the phosphates? Now, that sugar-phosphate backbone does not itself contain any information. That's the medium upon which the information is stuck. Do you see that there's a bond between the letters and that sugar-phosphate backbone? Okay? That there is a chemical force of attraction that causes the letters in the message to be stuck to the backbone. But do you see that there are no forces of attraction between the A's, C's, G's, and T's? No little sticks? Okay? Not like a crystal of salt where you would represent that with a bond. Here there's no force of chemical attraction responsible for the sequential arrangement of the A's, C's, G's, and T's. There is a bond that explains why the letters stick to the backbone, but that bond will allow any one of the four letters, the A, the C, the G, or the T, to stick. Any one of the four chemicals, the information-carrying chemicals, to stick at any site along the way. Now, that's some pretty heavy chemistry, but let me make it real simple. Okay, I've got an illustration. Now, I'm pandering to the local audience here in eastern Washington and northern Idaho. I don't know if people from northern Idaho root for the Gonzaga Bulldogs basketball team, but everyone in Spokane that we've met this last week is mad about this basketball team, and they have a nickname called the Zags, okay? So if you're from Spokane, you might say, "Go Zags," all right? Now, this is a metallic chalkboard. These are letters with little magnets in it, and I obviously have a small amount of information here on the board, right? A section of functional information. Now, here's a question. Can we explain the arrangement of these letters that constitute this message as a result of the magnetic forces of attraction that are in play here? Obviously, the answer is no, right? The magnets explain why the letters stick to the backboard, but they don't explain the arrangement of the letters. And I can demonstrate that simply by rearranging the letters to get this new non-message ogza-ag, okay? That is not a functional sequence of characters, all right? Same forces of physical attraction, but now there's no information, okay? What does explain, and now what I'm doing is I'm drawing a physical analogy to what's going on in DNA. In DNA, there is also not a backboard, but a backbone. There is a medium upon which the message is inscribed. There is also an informational sequence, a message, if you will. And there is a force of attraction that explains why the nucleotide bases stick to the backbone, but that force of attraction does not explain the sequential arrangement of the characters in the genetic message. A lot of scientists wanted to explain the origin of the information as a result of self-ordering, self-organizing properties of physics and chemistry. But you can see by looking carefully at the DNA molecule that you can no more explain the information in it as a result of those forces of chemical attraction that cause the bases to stick to the backbone than you can by invoking magnetic forces of attraction to explain the origin of our little message here. Okay? In both cases, in the words of one famous chemist, he says the origin of the information is extraneous to the physics and chemistry. Where does the information come from in my illustration, by the way? It's obvious it's coming from, well, at least a quasi-intelligent designer. It came from me, right? Okay, from a mind, all right? So this is really, in a way, very suggestive. Now, as I began to look at, here's the famous chemist. His name is Michael Polanyi. He was a colleague of Einstein's and a brilliant man. In 1967-68, he wrote two articles, one called Life Transcending Physics and Chemistry, and another one in Science Magazine called Life's Irreducible Structure. And he made this point. He says, as the arrangement of the printed page is extraneous to the chemistry of the printed page, he's talking about like the ink in a headline. You've got chemistry that explains why the ink sticks to the paper, but that does not explain, he's going to say, how the ink gets arranged to convey information. As the arrangement of the printed page is extraneous to the chemistry of the printed page, so is the base sequence in a DNA molecule extraneous to the chemical forces at work in the molecule. You can't explain the information as a result of the physics and the chemistry. There's something beyond it that's responsible. Now, what could that be? Well, we've looked at chance, we've looked at chance, and we've looked at law, we've looked at chance and law combined. And as I began to investigate this question of the DNA enigma, I found that there were variations on these different models that I've been presenting today. So I haven't exhausted, done an exhaustive critique of all of them. But the same basic problems kept repeating over and over again. For example, scientists trying to explain the origin of information by reference to some sort of law-like properties of attraction or physical chemical laws ran into a kind of fundamental problem. Let's imagine, for example, that every time that there were some fundamental forces of attraction that were responsible for the arrangement of the bases in the DNA molecule. What would you get? What if every time you got an A, an adenine base, you got there was a sticky force that caused a guanine, a G, to attach. And that G then caused an A to attach, and that A then caused another G to attach. And on ad infinitum, what would you get? Would you have a molecule that was informational, that was capable of providing instructions for building an intricate protein structure? Imagine that someone were to stand up here and say, aga, 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 indefinitely. Would that be informational? Well, according to information scientists, the answer is no. What you have in that case is not, strictly speaking, information. It's what they call a redundant sequence. It's repeating over and over and over again. Now, you can explain order or describe order in a law-like way because it's repetitive. You can write a formula to describe it. For example, if you have a computer that's spitting out the sequence ABC over and over again, that's not communicating anything, but you could write a formula or an algorithm to ask the computer to do that. So sometimes you have scientists that have said, well, I know we don't have an explanation for the origin of the information you need to build the first life now, but we're going to discover a law of nature that's later going to help us explain the origin of information. Problem with that is that it's a contradiction in terms. What we call natural laws describe repetitive patterns. They describe things that happen the same way over and over again. If I drop a ball 10 times, I've witnessed the properties of gravitation the same way over and over again. Every time I drop the ball, it falls. Repeating patterns can be described by laws. But when we're talking about information, we're talking about something like the phrase, time and tide wait for no man. We're talking about something that isn't rigidly repeating, but rather something that is unpredictable, and yet where the characters involved are highly specified according to some convention, a grammar, a vocabulary, a code, in order to convey meaning or function. And so that's not something that can be explained by reference to a natural law. It's not repeating in the way that natural laws are. So as I looked at these different approaches, I found that they all kind of came up short, whether we're talking about chance, law-like properties, or law-like equations, or whether we were in some way combining the two, as the Darwinians had tried to do by combining natural selection, a law-like mechanism, with random mutational change. So I began to ask myself, well, is there anything else that we know of that's capable of producing information? And I one day came across a quotation from a scientist who was an early advocate or an early pioneer in applying information theory to molecular biology. And he said this, he said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And this was kind of made a light go on for me, because at the same time, I was asking myself a question that had occurred to me as I first met some of the early advocates of the theory of intelligent design. One was a man named Charles Thaxton, who proposed that the information in DNA must have had some kind of intelligent source. He wrote a book in 1984 called The Mystery of Life's Origin, and I had occasion to meet him, and he had the idea, and it was somewhat intuitive at this point, that if you're talking about information, you're talking about something that is a mind product. And as I went off to grad school, knowing that it was such a problem to explain the origin of information, I began to wonder, could this intuition that information is pointing to mind or intelligence, could that be developed as a rigorous scientific argument? And naturally, as I began to investigate that question, I studied the works of Charles Darwin. Why? Because he had developed a scientific method for investigating events in the remote past. And he had a rule of reasoning that was very straightforward and commonsensical. And it was this. He said, if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, like the origin of life or the origin of information, you should be looking for a cause that's known to produce the effect in question. Made perfect sense. If you're trying to explain the layer of ash across eastern Washington, we would opt for the earthquake not the earthquake hypothesis, or the flood hypothesis. We'd opt for the volcanic eruption hypothesis, right? Because we know that volcanoes have demonstrated the power to produce volcanic ash, whereas floods and earthquakes don't do that kind of thing. So when I saw this quotation, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity, it made a light go on for me, because I remembered Darwin's rule of reasoning. If we're trying to explain an event in the remote past, we should be looking for a cause which is known to have the power to produce the effect in question, and known from our repeated experience. That was Darwin's key criterion. Well, this guy says, from our repeated experience, we habitually know that life is the product of conscious activity. And I asked myself a question, is that right? Is it true that information always comes from conscious activity? Is that what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which, according to Darwin and his contemporaries and scientists today, is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past? And I realized that it was. Not only had all these origin of life theories failed to come up with an alternative cause for the origin of information, we knew from ordinary experience that information always arises from an intelligent source. Whether we're talking about a headline in a newspaper, a paragraph in a book, a hieroglyphic inscription, information embedded in a radio signal, information always comes from intelligence. So when we find information in the DNA molecule, I have argued in my book Signature in the Cell, we can infer with confidence that we are seeing evidence of a prior designing intelligence. Now, it turns out that we use this form of reasoning all the time. This is accepted not only in scientific circles, but in ordinary life. One day I was on the ferry, the Victoria Clipper, going up to Vancouver Island and Victoria Harbor in Canada. And as I entered the harbor, I looked out and I saw a pattern of red and yellow flowers on the hillside, and I have some astigmatism, and so I was attracted to this pattern, but I didn't know what it was, and so I put my glasses on, and I immediately drew what my colleague William Dembski calls a design inference. Why? Because the red and yellow pattern on the hillside was actually an arrangement of English characters that spelled the message, "Welcome to Victoria." And I made the brilliant deduction that gardeners had been at work, intelligent designers. Information is, in our experience, universally in our experience, an indicator of prior activity. Why? Because we know of no other cause other than intelligence that produces information in a digital form, especially when we're talking about functional information, information that does a job or communicates a message. Now, this principle is also conceded by people who have no vested interest in this debate and who are, in fact, metaphysically hostile to the idea that there might be an intelligent designer behind life. I refer to people who are investigating the possibility that there might be an intelligent designer or an intelligent being out in space, the project known as Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a cartoon where you've got guys with the big radio telescopes looking for evidence of intelligent design embedded in a radio signal. What are they looking for? In the actual scientific world, not the cartoon, they're looking for information embedded in a radio signal in digital form. These guys in the cartoon say, as I read it, we're receiving a message from space telling us to stop bombarding them with unintelligent messages. One senator said of the Search for Extraterrestrial program, which has gotten quite a lot of federal money, he said, we'd do a lot better to use our money to look for intelligent life in Washington. In any case, what is my point? My point is that when we encounter information, we assume that it is the result of intelligence, and that even scientists who are hostile to the intelligent design hypothesis in biology assume that if they were to find information embedded in a radio signal coming from space, that they were encountering ET. They were encountering an extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, thankfully, or not thankfully, depending on your point of view, we have not encountered such an intelligence in outer space, and no evidence of same. But in the inner workings of the cell, in the DNA molecule, we have a compelling indicator of intelligent activity, and that is the information in the DNA molecule. And what I've done in the book Signature in the Cell is actually develop this case as a rigorous scientific argument using the method that Charles Darwin himself used in The Origin of Species. And I come to the ironic conclusion that Darwin was wrong about that there was no evidence of actual design. Darwin used a method that's sometimes called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And that's what I've done in this lecture. You compare different possible explanations or causes to try to explain a key effect or event in the remote past. You evaluate them to see which cause best explains the evidence, and then you infer that cause which provides the best explanation. Now, the key question, the obvious question is, what constitutes the best explanation? Well, Darwin and other scientists have had that worked out. They said that the explanation that was best was the one that referred to a cause which is known from our uniform and repeated experience to produce the effect in question. Darwin's scientific mentor, Charles Lyell, the famous geologist, put it this way. He says that we should be looking for causes that are now in operation. And when I saw that phrase, another light bulb went on for me, because I asked the question, what is the cause now operating that is known to have the power to produce information? And again, there's only one. It's intelligence. And so I concluded, in the case I make in the book, using Darwin's method, that if you look at all the competing classes of causal explanation that have been provided or proposed to explain the origin of information, that intelligence or intelligent design is the best explanation. Neither chance nor necessity, law-like necessity, nor the combination of chance and necessity have demonstrated the power to produce information, but intelligent agents have repeatedly done so, and therefore intelligent design stands as the best explanation for the DNA enigma, this critical mystery of the origin of the information you need to build the first life.